Well, good morning, Chapel family. It has been and it continues to be a privilege to be part of the Chapel family. I love that God has allowed Jen and I to partner with you here at the Chapel, and our family joined the Chapel back in 2008, a little over 11 years ago, and Lydia was 6 and Abigail was 5 years old when we came. We felt loved and cared for the entire time. But in the year 2019, God has had us going through kind of an eventful year because Jen and I believe that God is leading us to a change. For a while, we didn't know what that change was, but we knew God was doing something. Today, we are confident that God is calling us to serve as missionaries with Reach Global and the EFCA, which is our denomination, which means I will be stepping down as pastor of student ministries sometime mid to late 2020. So let me step back a little bit. I graduated from Trinity International University in 1995 with a bachelor's degree in youth ministry. I believed then, and I still believe today, that God has called me to serve in student ministries. I love God and I love students. Teenagers are a great stage of life where their identity is being formed, their faith, they're beginning to own their faith, and they're willing to step out to try to make a difference in the world. I love that God has given me the opportunity to walk along so many in this process. I love my job, right, that I've had over the past 24 plus years, but I've always seen it as a calling. So earlier this year in 2019, Jen and I believed that God was leading us to some kind of change, but we didn't know what that was. We were pretty confident it wasn't to another church somewhere. That didn't make any sense to us. So we questioned whether God might be leading us to some other kind of ministry in the chapel. Then God allowed me to go on the Israel trip this last March. And it was pretty amazing, of course. As you know, many of you have been there. It's pretty amazing. You should go. Towards the end of that trip, we had the privilege of visiting the Temple Mount, which in my mind is the epicenter of world history and the epicenter of what's going on in the world today, and became the epicenter of what God was doing in my life in 2019 in this journey He had us on. As we were touring and walking around the temple, I believe that the Holy Spirit spoke to me. It wasn't an out loud voice. Don't worry about that. But I'm pretty confident the Holy Spirit spoke to me that day in a way that kind of stopped me in my tracks and made me listen. I think He said two things. The first thing was something that was related to the Israel trip itself, but the second thing I believe God said was that I'm releasing you from your role in youth group. I was pretty surprised. I didn't tell anyone at first, partly because I wanted to pray about it and process it later with trusted friends and mentors, and I certainly didn't tell Pastor Phil because I didn't want him to say, I heard the same thing. You're fired, find your way home. So I got home from Israel, thankfully. Over the next 3 months, Jen and I, we prayed and we processed this leading, and we did start talking to Pastor Phil shortly after the trip, and we explored a lot of different options of how I could serve in adult ministries or something else, and each time we discussed an idea, it excited me. I went home thinking, oh, that sounds great. And Jen and I, we'd think about it and we'd pray about it. And each time I was left feeling led that wasn't where God had me. So for time's sake, I'll just summarize what happened, right? I remember that God's calling for me has always been in student ministries, right? I have deep roots in student ministries. I have a ton of experience, including leading around 15 missions trips in student ministries. I have a lot of connections. I play a role in equipping and mentoring other youth pastors in the Great Lakes District. So as Jen and I prayed and processed, we believed that God was still calling us to something else, but we were pretty sure it was still in the area of student ministries. Eventually, God led us to apply as missionaries in the Evangelical Free Church of America to serve with an organization called APEX. APEX is the Evangelical Free Church's student and college missions ministry that they have. APEX exists to mobilize the emerging generation of gospel influencers who take the gospel from here to everywhere. So 80% of my role will be with APEX as Director of International Youth Group Teams. And the other 20% will be dedicated to expanding what I've done with the Great Lakes District in my role as Director of Student Ministries there that I've volunteered in for the last 6 or so years. So APEX has two core values. First one is missional relationships, which means they work to connect EFCA high school students and college students with EFCA Reach Global missionaries, very much like what we've done here at the chapel and bringing students to our sister church in Slatina, Pietravi, where Apex and we want to partner students with these missionaries to serve those missionaries in a way to advance the gospel mission that God has called that missionary. Not just to go have an experience, but help advance what that missionary is doing on the mission field there. Their second core value is being gospel-centered, which means that a goal of Apex experiences is to send students home after their experience trained and equipped to live missionally and gospel-focused in all areas of life. Apex missions are not just about changing the world, but changing the way students live in the world when they return from the missions experience. So personally, as pastor of student ministries, I've always loved missions experiences that we've got to take students on. Like I said, I've led around 15 of those. And I love doing those trips and getting students out of the building because it gives them a much larger view of who God is. They get to see God working in much greater ways. It gets them out of the American culture and see that God is doing more than what he's just doing here. He's working in great ways here, but he's doing even more than that. It teaches them a dependence on God as they step out of their comfort zone. Which is a huge value. It gives them a training ground to see how God can use them for the gospel. That God can use students, he can use teenagers to change the world. It helps students spend less time looking in at themselves, which is something we all struggle with, and helps them and gives them an opportunity to look out towards others. Right? All of which helps them to grow in their desire to continue to live with and live like and live for Jesus in all aspects of life. So, this is something that I'm very excited about to be a part of, but not only do I get to be a part of this, I'm getting to expand Apex in a whole new way. Apex has existed for a long time. It used to be called BUMP, Bridging Urban Missions Project, and Trek 7. Trek 7 is the college 7-week missions experiences that the Free Church had to partner college students with EFCA missionaries to give them a taste of what missions would be like, and BUMP is the high school and middle school domestic missions trips. Apex is the merger of those two organizations. And that happened a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago. Apex has never, though, had the ability to offer international youth missions experiences, which, as we know from here at the chapel and the many experiences we've had, those are very powerful experiences. So I'm excited that God is calling me and Jen to fill this role. I've known that Apex had this need for a very long time, but I never expected or even considered that God would call me to fill it. So there is one more hurdle. Jen and I, it's hard to step down from this role. We love this role. We love the students. We love where we're at. But Jen and I are confident that God is leading us to be missionaries with Apex. And just like most other missionaries, that means we will be in the process of looking for those God is calling to be partners with us in this mission. Those who will be our senders through prayer and financial support. I'm so thankful that the chapel leadership and the missions team is already committed to being our sending church and giving very generous support, but we still have a long way to go. Being missionaries is very much like starting a small business, right? There are startup costs, salaries, health insurance, ministry expenses, lots of things like that need to be raised in this process. So here's the ask. Would you consider, or if you feel led in helping us get rolling with this? You will find in that handout in the briefings there with my face on it, the bottom of the page, a website, give.efca.org with the designation. You can help launch us into the support raising process and ultimately into Apex missions by giving there. And then would you pray about whether God might be calling you personally to be our ministry partners in this calling to Apex missions? Would you be one of our senders? Right? Jen and I will be looking for opportunities to meet with anyone over the next few months who might be led and willing to be monthly prayer and financial supporters. Lastly, we'll be at the kiosk in the foyer right out there to answer any questions you have about the transition, about support raising, about Apex. And if you already feel led or you want more information about how to be a monthly supporter, we have little cards out there you could fill out that includes like a little checkbox that says, buy me a coffee. And then I'll tell you about it. So you can even check that box. And don't worry. You don't have to look down and walk past us quickly if you're not sure that you're going to be a supporter. I've not supported every missionary I've ever known either, so that's okay. All right, a little business to close. This transition is still months away. We're looking at mid to late 2020. It's very much dependent on support raising. The youth pastor search process to find my replacement will be starting soon, right? And during this transition, nothing will change in the student ministries. It'll carry on just as usual. I'll continue in that role. And lastly, when this transition is done, I am thankful that Jen and I will not have to move away for this role. St. Joseph will still be our home, and the chapel will still be our church. I'm very thankful for that. So we greatly appreciate your prayers, and as you think of it, would you pray for Jen and I? Would you pray for the students? Would you pray for the student ministry leaders as they go through this transition, for the youth pastor search? And of course, we ask, would you pray for Apex as well? So thank you for the privilege of being part of your family.
Stand.